A lot of you guys asked me to go over this viral talk by Dr. Chris Knobbe called Diseases of Civilization, Are Seed Oil Excesses the Unifying Mechanism? So I reached out to Dr. Knobbe. I asked him if he wanted to come on and talk about it. It sounds like right now Dr. Knobbe is not interested in doing that, which is 100% his right, of course. So we're going to go over the talk and I'm going to touch on the main points. And Dr. Knobbe, if you happen to watch this one day and you change your mind, we can talk anytime. This is an open invitation. All right, let's do it.
Ladies and gentlemen, could the seed oils be the primary cause of the diseases of civilization? Heart disease, hypertension, stroke, cancers, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, obesity, Alzheimer's disease, macular degeneration, the list goes on and on. And could these so-called heart-healthy vegetable oils actually and ironically be the primary cause of heart disease and the major cause of all these other diseases of civilization as well?
Okay, so the idea is that seed oils may be behind these chronic diseases that we suffer from and that we die of. Yeah, let's see what the argument is. Let's see what the evidence is that he's found that led him to this belief.
Now, dare I have the audacity to question the Harvard School of Public Health? And the nutrition department of Tufts University, and the nutrition department of Mayo Clinic, and the American Heart Association.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite things about science, actually. You can question anyone you want, right? Doesn't matter, prestigious institution, Nobel laureate, it doesn't matter. You can disagree, you can question, and if the evidence backs up your view, your idea, then you're right and the Nobel laureate is wrong. So yeah, this is one of the most beautiful things about science.
Now, if you look at processed food as a percentage of the American diet, all this in the red, you can see, as of 2009, 63 to 74% of the American diet is made up of processed food. And processed food is just four things: vegetable oil, trans fats, sugar, and refined wheat flour, right?
Well, there's a lot more stuff in processed foods, right? I mean, plants and animal products and fruits and vegetables contained in many different types of processed foods. There's potatoes, there's emulsifiers, there's dyes, there's preservatives, there's a gazillion ingredients. So there's a lot more than four. But I think the key fact here, and this is absolutely correct, is the majority of the calories in the average American's diet now come from ultra-processed foods. And I think this is a very sobering statistic, and I'm not sure how we got to this point, but yeah, it's a huge problem, and something's got to change.
In the 19th century, diabetes of any type was rare, and presumably rare for all of history prior. 1935, it's rising, 0.37%. This continues to rise, and we're at 9.4% by 2015. This is a 25-fold increase in type 2 diabetes in 80 years. How about obesity? 19th century. We know that obesity was 1.2% in men age 18 to 80 in Texas and Nebraska prisons, right? Okay, look at this. By 1960, we're at 13% obesity. That was a 10-fold increase already, right, when we thought we were lean. So this continues to rise. And by 2015, we're at 39.8% obesity, right? This is a 33-fold increase in obesity in about 115 years, and we are on target to be at 50% of Americans obese by 2030. That was published in JAMA just a few weeks ago.
Okay, so he's been going over these historical trends, diabetes increasing, obesity increasing by a ton. Obviously, there's a million things going on in these 100 years or so. There's many possible causes, and there's a lot of evidence pointing to what the possible causes might be. I guess he's leading up to saying that it's the seed oils, because that's the title of the talk. We'll see.
Look at the vegetable oil in black versus the heart disease deaths in red, right? Everybody see a remarkable correlation?
Okay, here it is. So he's pointing to this correlation between the vegetable oil intake and the heart disease deaths. Now, actually, this is strange because the vegetable oils, they skyrocket after the heart disease deaths go up. looks like a couple decades later, so that doesn't make sense. But let's say that the correlation was perfect, right? Let's say that the vegetable oil intake goes up, and after that, the heart disease deaths go up in parallel. Let's say it's perfect parallel. We still wouldn't conclude cause and effect from this type of data, right? This is what we call an ecological association. There's 1,000 other things going on. We can't tell if there's cause and effect relationship here or not. Actually, there's an issue here. He's using a graph that's looking at heart disease deaths in thousands. So it's the absolute number. It's the number of people who died of heart disease. But over these 100 years, the human population increased enormously by several fold. So even if the risk of heart disease death stays the same, if the population size increases, you're going to have more people dying of heart disease. The risk could even go down of dying of heart disease, but if the size of the population goes up a ton, you'll still see more deaths, right? So we can't use number of deaths. We have to use rate, the percentage of people that die of heart disease. That gives us a measure of risk. So here's an example. This is also for the US, like his slide. It's rate, so it's adjusted for population size. It's age standardized, which is very important because we live longer now. We get older now. So this is all matched for age and population, everything. The two solid lines are the deaths from heart disease. Blue is men, red is women. And so, yeah, over the first 60 years, for the women, maybe it goes up a little bit. For the men, it goes up maybe a 50% increase in deaths. And then after 1970-ish, it's been crashing down for both sexes. And notice that by the end, 21st century, it's lower, substantially lower than in 1900. And we can try to overlay his vegetable oil intake curve on this. It looks something like this. So vegetable oil intake really takes off around 1960, and it's about 10 years later, we see the deaths from heart disease start to crash down and come down pretty abruptly. So you see the importance of looking at rates. You see how the picture changes completely. Now, does this prove that the vegetable oil intake lowered heart disease deaths? No, not from this type of data. We don't get that conclusion. Again, ecological association, right? There's 1,000 other things going on. We have no idea if this is cause and effect or just a coincidence or what. We could look at many other metrics. We could look at life expectancy. Went up consistently over the course of the 20th century. Does that mean that seed oils increase our life expectancy and make us live longer? No, we don't get that information from this association, right? So you see the point. You could use any curve, all kinds of metrics that go up or down, right? There's all kinds of kind of playful jokes on the internet about this. There's ice cream sales correlate with freeway accidents, things like that, right? Just kind of playfully showing that these associations don't reveal cause and effect. This is why it's much more interesting to do this as a dialogue with the person one-on-one, because he shows the slide, he suggests this, and we go over this logic, and then he comes back with some other question or counter, so it's much more fun. So yeah, we're going to move on, but bottom line, when you see these historical trends and these ecological associations, always remember, these are good for clues. We can ask questions based on these, but ultimately we want to test these things in kind of tighter scientific tests, scientific studies. All right, so hopefully he's going to go over all of that.
The Masai tribe of Kenya and Tanzania. Now, this is what all these Masai warriors, all the Masai look like this. Lean, healthy, chiseled, fantastically healthy people, right? Well, anyway, George Mann and colleagues in 1970, around 1970, 1972, extensively studied them. Now, what do the Masai eat? Milk, meat, and blood from the cattle they herd. They're pastoralists. The typical warrior drinks 3 to 5 quarts of raw, whole milk per day, and their milk has a lot of saturated fat. 3,000 calories a day. These guys only weigh about 128 pounds on average a piece. Their diet is 66% animal fat, 33 to 45% of that is saturated animal fat. It's about 17% carb, 1.7% omega-6 fat. Now that's the number I want you to pay attention to this whole time if you would. All right, well, what did George Mann find? They did 50 autopsies and they did, I think it was 350 EKGs, no heart disease, no heart attacks, except one possible silent MI in the entire group.
Okay, let's take a look at the study. He has it here, Mann, 1972. Okay, so it's this. Atherosclerosis in the Masai, 1972. Hearts and aorta of 50 Masai men were collected at autopsy. Measurements of the aorta showed extensive atherosclerosis with lipid infiltration and fibrous changes, but very few complicated lesions. The coronary arteries showed intimal thickening by atherosclerosis, which equaled that of old US men. Okay, so they do have plenty of plaque, plenty of heart disease developing, but not that much advanced plaque, looks like. The Masai vessels enlarge with age to more than compensate for this disease. It's speculated that the Masai are protected from their atherosclerosis by physical fitness, which causes their coronary vessels to be capacious. Okay, really interesting idea. Now, this dilation is seen normally, even in Westerners. Imaging specialists call this positive remodeling. It's basically the artery dilates to try to compensate for the plaque growing. But there's a limit to that. The artery can only dilate so much, and so at some point it stops. And if the plaque keeps growing, it's going to encroach on the lumen, the space through which the blood runs. The other interesting thing is heart disease, like heart attacks and strokes and things like that, they actually usually don't arise from plaque filling up the lumen. It's usually a smaller plaque, actually, that's more vulnerable, that bursts, and then that causes coagulation. That fills up the lumen acutely, rapidly, even if the plaque initially was not that large, wasn't occupying that much of the lumen. Okay, so they do have substantial heart disease developing. Now, I'm guessing that they don't consume seed oils. That he said that omega-6 intake is very low. So we know seed oils are not necessary for heart disease to develop. We already knew that. There's fossilized remains from pre-agricultural societies showing heart disease, which is very fascinating. But yeah, we know that modern foods and seed oils and all these ultra-processed foods are not necessary for heart disease. But what we don't know, and we can't get from this, is would seed oils make this worse? Would it make it better? Would it make no difference? We can't tell from this type of ecological data in a tribe somewhere. And that's the main limitation. Also, how old are these people? Okay, so half of them are 39 and under. Most of them are under 50, 40 something. There's only 8 people who are over 60. So yeah, that makes more sense. They're skewed pretty young. And they don't have a lot of the risk factors that Westerners have. Obesity, cigarettes, blood pressure, I'm guessing theirs is not high. So it's actually surprising that they have this much plaque growing. It's expected that it would grow slower and that the advanced stages of heart disease, like heart attacks and things just going haywire, would probably hit them later. So yeah, what can we get from this? Plaque doesn't require seed oils. Could seed oils make this worse or better? Yes, but we can't tell. This is why we need studies. We need defined populations that are reasonably matched, and then we give them different fats, and we see what happens to their arteries and to heart disease events and all that. So here's a quick example. One meta-analysis concluded that randomized control trials lowering the intake of dietary saturated fat and replacing it with polyunsaturated vegetable oils reduced cardiovascular disease by about 30%. And when they say cardiovascular disease, they're not talking about just plaque or cholesterol level. This is actual events. So it's heart attacks and strokes and death and things like that. Another meta-analysis concluded consuming polyunsaturated fats, PUFAs, in place of saturated fat reduces coronary heart disease events, there it is, in randomized control trials. A shift towards greater PUFA consumption in place of saturated fat would reduce rates of coronary heart disease. And they were looking at 15% of calories versus 5% of calories coming from PUFAs. Pretty big difference. And they saw a 10% reduction in heart disease risk for each 5% of calories of increased PUFA. So those are 2 quick examples. There's a lot of studies on this. We could sit here for hours going over them. But do you see the difference in experimental design, right? This is what I want you guys to understand. When you take a population that is more or less homogeneous, you split them randomly, you give them different fats, and you observe what happens over time. It's not like one population smokes, the other doesn't, or one exercises and the other are couch potatoes, right? Whereas when we compare, here are the Masai living in Africa, let's compare that to the average citizen of Chicago. There's a gazillion differences, so we can't pin it on oil or anything else. By the way, these studies are not funded by big seed oil or big butter or big olive oil or any of that, and I don't make a cent from any of these industries either.
So this is an animal fat diet. This is polyunsaturated fat diet. Animal fat, polyunsaturated fat. How many times should I do this?
So we have a lot of randomized trials doing this, giving people different fats and observing the result in weight loss, weight gain, adiposity, body weight. So I know he's doing this kind of almost joking. He's showing the pictures and going back and forth. This maybe like a communication strategy, but just bearing in mind as a viewer, as a consumer of information, that being shown these Google images, right, these stock pictures, is not scientific evidence. You want to know what happens when you consume this fat versus that fat in reasonably controlled, reasonably matched conditions. So, quick example, there's a meta-analysis that looked at all these different fats compared head to head. Butter and olive oil and palm oil and 5 or 6 types of seed oils. And the best one for weight loss out of all these fats compared head to head was actually sesame seed oil. Butter, when compared to all these vegetable oils one-on-one, there was no significant difference on any of these matches. Palm oil, which is largely saturated fat, it's a vegetable saturated fat, did very poorly. I think it was the worst out of the panel of 15 or so fats. And neither the butter nor the palm, the two saturated versions, beat any of the vegetable oils head to head. It was either non-significant or they lost. Now, bear in mind, this is a very important distinction. This is looking at the oils themselves studied in an experiment, right? A lot of times when people say, well, I cut the seed oils and I lost weight, what they really mean is they stop eating ultra-processed snacks and they stop going to Burger King. And so, yeah, if that's what you mean by seed oils, then absolutely cut the seed oils from your life. But just understanding this difference, that one thing is the junk food world, and another thing is looking at the effect of the oil itself to cook at home, for example, or to add to foods. And there we don't see these problematic effects. And actually, depending on the outcome, depending on the parameter that we're interested in, we often see benefits. Another really interesting piece of information, we're going to move along pretty soon. I don't want to bog this down. But there's a really fascinating emerging data set that looks at all the different categories of ultra-processed foods. And the worst offender when it comes to weight gain and all these chronic diseases is soda, sugar-sweetened beverages, which is a category that doesn't contain seed oils. The vast majority, maybe there's a soda out there that contains it, but in general, soda has no oil. So if we want to solve the junk food problem, and we do, it's a massive problem, we need to focus on the right thing. And that's excessive junk food in people's diets, with or without seed oil in there.
Okay, let's move down to Tokelau in the South Pacific, kind of midway between Hawaii and Australia. 3 little islands down there, atolls. Guess what? 2% of their diet is PUFA. Now that's total PUFA. That's omega-6 and omega-3 together. Well, so where are they getting their PUFA? From fish and coconut. That means that about half of that was omega-3. So their omega-6 PUFA is about 1%. Again, that's the number I want you to pay attention to, if you would. 1982, they studied men 40 to 69 years of age, no heart attacks, virtually no obesity, no diabetes in this population. They are fantastically healthy.
Okay, another indigenous population, same logic exactly, right? They don't have seed oils. They also don't have olive oil and avocado oil or maybe even butter. That doesn't tell us anything about the health effect of these foods. Maybe those foods make people less healthy. Maybe they would actually be better. Maybe whatever these people die of, the risk of that would be lower if they consume some seed oils. We just can't jump to conclusions. We just don't know what the effect of the foods they don't eat is from looking at these correlations.
What was the omega-6 fat in anybody's adipose who was on an ancestral diet? Anybody in the world. I finally found it. Tokelauans, right here. 3.8%. It is off the chart low. Remember I said their omega-6 in their diet was roughly 1%? 3.8%, people. This is where we should be. And this is what keeps you healthy. Right here.
So you see the logical leap there, right? This is what this indigenous population has. So that's what's healthy. That's where we want to be. You can't make that logical leap from that association to cause and effect. He's looked at no evidence that this level is any better than anything else. This level of omega-6s in their body could have nothing to do with their health. Maybe they would be healthier if their omega-6 level was higher. We don't know from this type of data. Of course, if someone prefers to eat no seed oils, that's fine. You don't need them in your diet. But none of this tells us what is the effect of seed oils in humans, which is the question we want to ask.
What do these healthy populations not have? No sugar, no refined wheat, no processed foods, and no vegetable oils, of course, right?
Right. So you have multiple differences right there on the slide. And this isn't exhaustive, of course. They also don't smoke. They also exercise a lot. They also don't have pollution. They also, genetics are different, right? Maybe the reason is one of these four. Maybe the reason is not one of these four. Maybe it's something else we haven't thought of, right? This is why we have to test. We have to take these different ideas, these different theories that could all be wrong, and test them in scientific studies.
So when you consume omega-6 to excess, which is going to be a westernized diet, it'll have nutrient deficiencies, but what matters is it combines with reactive oxygen species, and this leads to electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation failure. Electron transport chain is where we create 90% of our energy. The very first thing that happens when the electron transport chain fails in this scenario is that it starts shooting out reactive oxygen species. Then the next thing that happens is insulin resistance. So that ends up leading to metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and so forth.
Okay, perfect. So he's got this schematic there. Omega-6, eating a lot of it causes peroxidation, messes up your mitochondria. That should lead to insulin resistance, diabetes, fatty liver. The important thing to understand when you see these arguments based on a biochemical pathway or molecular logic is that we can put together one of these scenarios pointing in any direction we want. So for example, seed oils are pretty high in vitamin E. That's tocopherol, that's an antioxidant. So if we eat more seed oils, our antioxidant levels are going to be higher. That should protect our mitochondria. That should reduce risk of insulin resistance and diabetes. Another one of the causes of insulin resistance is this molecule called diacylglycerol, or DAG. When that accumulates in muscle, it causes insulin resistance. And there's an enzyme that breaks that down, but that enzyme has a higher affinity for unsaturated fats, like omega-6s. So more omega-6s, more activity of the enzyme that breaks down DAG, less insulin resistance, less diabetes. You see, all of these scenarios, including his, they have a nugget of truth. All of these physiological cellular processes are real. They're all plausible. They're all valid ideas. They're hypotheses. That's the realization. This is a hypothesis, a mechanistic hypothesis. So how do we know at the end of the day which direction this goes? If I eat more omega-6s, does that make my diabetes better or worse? Does that reduce or increase insulin resistance? The answer is always the same. We test, right? We give human beings different types of fats and we observe. So here's a randomized trial, for example, that gave people omega-6s compared to saturated fat. Liver fat was lower during the PUFA diet than the saturated fat diet. TNF receptor 2 and IL-1 receptor antagonist, these are inflammation-related molecules. They were lower during the PUFA diet. Insulin tended to be higher during the saturated fat diet. And cholesterol and triglycerides were lower during the PUFA diet. Conclusion: compared with saturated fat, omega-6s reduce liver fat and modestly improve metabolic status without weight loss. A high omega-6 PUFA intake does not cause any signs of inflammation or oxidative stress. So you see, we can hypothesize all day based on biochemical pathways. Maybe you'll go that way, maybe you'll go this way. But we ultimately want to test what is the actual health effect in human beings of the food. And sometimes these tests surprise us. That's why we run them. Otherwise, we wouldn't need to test anything in science. Here's a meta-analysis of randomized trials. Another example real quick. Replacing saturated fat with PUFAs significantly lowered glucose, hemoglobin A1C, C-peptide, and HOMA. HOMA is an index of insulin resistance. PUFAs significantly improved insulin secretion. Conclusions: most consistent favorable effects were seen with PUFAs. They were linked to improved glycemia, insulin resistance, and insulin secretion. Bear in mind that you can improve insulin resistance and put diabetes in remission on almost any diet as long as you lose weight. We've known that for a long time. Weight loss is a very powerful lever of improving glucose metabolism. But the relevance of this is in these trials, we're looking at these fats matched, calorie matched, right? So it's apples to apples. We're asking, without this confounder of the weight loss, is one fat better, is one fat worse than the other? Okay, last example real quick before we move on. This is long term. So this meta-analysis looked at people consuming different levels of linoleic acid. That's the main omega-6 found in seed oils. The follow-up was several years, up to 32 years. So high intake of linoleic acid was associated with a 6% lower risk of diabetes. Not a huge effect, but people eating more linoleic acid had a bit less diabetes. If anything, it was in the direction of less diabetes. These results held, by the way, when they were adjusted for smoking and exercise and things like that. Each 5% of calories coming from linoleic acid was associated with 10% lower risk of type 2 diabetes. So it depends on the amount. The lowest risk of diabetes was seen at the highest intakes of linoleic acid. Now, these studies have limitations. Every study ever conducted has limitations, but the point is, when we look at tests in humans systematically, what we keep seeing is that, if anything, when you compare omega-6s and PUFAs to saturated fats, for example, the PUFAs seem to be better for fatty liver, for insulin resistance, for diabetes, matched calorie for calorie. And a lot of these studies are focusing on a comparison with saturated fat. That's common, and I think that's the comparison he's also kind of zoning in on. But when we compare the seed oils, like canola, for example, to olive oil or to nuts and seeds, these whole forms of fat, we don't see any clear superiority. That seems to be basically a tie. We have a lot of videos on that, and I'll link that below. So I'd be really curious to ask Dr. Knobbe if he's had the opportunity to go over all these studies in humans, how he reconciles all these data with his views, because basically it all seems to go in the opposite direction of his hypotheses.
Loss of energy leads directly to nuclear and mitochondrial DNA mutations. And what do we get out of that? Cancers.
Perfect. Exact same thing, right? Eating more seed oils should cause, or omega-6s should cause this molecular change, and that should increase risk of cancer. The question is always the same, and you don't need scientific training to ask this question. Okay, interesting idea. Do people who consume more omega-6s, do people who consume more seed oils have more or less cancer? Show me those data, right? It's always the right question. So here's one example. This meta-analysis found lower cancer mortality with higher linoleic acid intake. They also found lower cardiovascular mortality and lower total mortality. And they also measured linoleic acid in the tissues, so the levels in the body, like fat or blood. This is really interesting because our body can't make linoleic acid. It's an essential nutrient. So whatever's in there came from food. And the main source in the Western diet are these vegetable oils. And so people with more linoleic acid in their tissues had lower cancer mortality, lower cardiovascular mortality, lower total mortality. There's a study that looks at cooking with different fats. Large study, 500,000 people over 16 years. So compared to cooking with butter, that's the reference in this graph, people who cooked with canola oil or corn oil had a lower risk of cancer or death. To the left of the line is lower. And these results are adjusted for education, income, smoking, alcohol, exercise, etc. This is risk of dying of cancer. In general, we tend to see lower risk with higher intake of omega-6s. For risk of actually developing cancer, of cancer incidence, there's a lot of data out there, a lot of data sets. I haven't seen much difference either way. We have some videos that cover that. I'll link that below as well.
So we're going to look at three studies, I believe it is.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to look at studies of the different types of fats, right? We're 30 minutes in, but so far it's been mostly kind of theories and hypotheses and pictures of indigenous populations. But so this is where the rubber meets the road. You want to know, okay, you give different fats to human beings, what's the effect? So we're there.
Isocaloric diets, okay? All the same calories. 3 groups of rats for 3 weeks, identical amounts of calories, protein, fat,
Why?
and carbs.
I don't get it.
And omega-3 fats. Only one single variable in this study, and this is a very well designed study, I believe.
Okay, so he just spent about 10 minutes going over these 3 rat studies, or I guess it was 2 rat studies and 1 mouse study showing that seed oils cause obesity, cause insulin resistance, cause diabetes in these animals. The thing is, we have data in humans, hundreds of studies, no exaggeration, looking at all these outcomes. In fact, we already looked at several of those, and we don't see this in humans. We see lower risk of fatty liver, lower risk of diabetes and insulin resistance. And so I don't understand what the point of this is. If you start your presentation with a couple rat studies and then you build up and then you go over human studies, that's fine. But it's all been theory so far. And now he's closing with rat studies. I don't think he's going to go over any human studies. Why do the effects of seed oils seem very different in lab animals versus humans? One thing is dose. A lot of these studies use very high doses, like 40% of calories from soybean oil or something like that. Yeah, that's not good. That's not recommended for humans either. Another thing is just physiological differences. Some are understood. So humans metabolize linoleic acid differently from mice. We tend to package the linoleic acid and triglycerides faster. In the mice, they stay as free fatty acids. So that leaves them available for conversion into arachidonic acid. That happens more readily in mice. So there are physiological differences, but the bottom line is we have plenty of data of the actual end result, the actual outcome as far as disease in human beings, and it looks different from the mice. So yeah, don't give seed oils to your pet animals, especially in large amounts, but for human beings, we don't see these effects. If anything, we tend to see benefits. It tends to be in the opposite direction. Here's the thing. You can disagree with hundreds of studies in humans. You can say, I don't agree with any of it. I think it's all wrong for these reasons. You can make an argument. What we can't do is not go over any of it, and we can't pretend it doesn't exist.
So this is what I want to say. Really? These oils are these fats are the same? Are you kidding me? I mean, the fats coming out of these this is a real vegetable oil refinery. This is what I can't tell them apart from petroleum oil refineries. You know, they look the same. This is what I would say. This is toxic waste coming out of vegetable oil refineries. This is extraordinarily dangerous to us. And the other one is, you know, the animal fat's divinely healthy.
What a great example of storytelling, right? We didn't really look at any of the tests, scientific tests of giving the oils to humans, but now we look at these stock pictures and these very emotional words, toxic waste, divinely healthy. Does this verbiage really belong in a scientific presentation? I mean, this is how advertising works, right? Just show you a beautiful picture of a meadow, don't give you any facts, but just by the emotions that it triggers, this looks great, buy our product. Obviously, these pictures tell us nothing about the health effect of consuming the foods. This is why we test things scientifically. Okay, I just realized he has a second talk at the same meeting that he gave a couple of years later. Same topic, also seed oils. So I went over it in case something changed or his views changed. It's very similar. Some of the slides are the same. It's mostly these ecological associations, historical trends. So I just want to highlight one thing real quick.
The most prestigious nutrition institutions in the world, Harvard School of Public Health, Mayo Clinic's Nutrition Department, Tufts University Nutrition Department, American Heart Association, Cleveland Clinic, on, all tell us these highly polyunsaturated vegetable oils are heart healthy, right? In fact, it says right on the label, heart healthy, right? So how can we question it? Why do they tell us this? There's one reason. They lower our cholesterol. Well, guess what? So does arsenic.
Yeah, see, it's right there. Just by watching this video, you guys know this is wildly off the mark. We have information on the effect of seed oils in human beings on actual cardiovascular events like heart attacks, on cancer, on diabetes, on insulin resistance, on fatty liver, on mortality from multiple causes, on total mortality. And the information we went over in this video is a sliver of the data we have. So yeah, if all we knew was that they lower cholesterol, I agree, that's not very impressive. So this explains it quite nicely. It's not that we have these completely different views or that we disagree per se. he hasn't had the chance to go over this enormous amount of evidence that we have on the health effects of these products in human beings. So when we say, oh, we're going to disagree with Harvard and the Mayo Clinic and this and that, great, we should disagree with authority. But first, let's learn what's out there, what's already known, what's already been done, and form our own opinions based on the information, right? And then sure, if somebody says something that doesn't make sense, disagree with them, whoever they are. But if we're forming these unshakable beliefs in a vacuum of information and then disagreeing just to disagree, just to be a rebel, that's not really being an independent thinker. Guys, we have a whole video on seed oils and inflammation, frequently asked question. The results are going to surprise you. Check it out in full right here. And here's a fascinating trial comparing canola oil to ghee, looking at fatty liver. Check those out. I'll see you in there. Bye-bye.